If you are currently leveling up your Django skills with this tutorial is part of a free YouTube playlist. The link to the whole playlist is in the video description. Now, if you love this tutorial and playlist, then you might also like to check out the whole course, Django Database ORM Mastery on Udemy. The link to the course, which should provide the best price, can be found in the video description. Having introduced Pytest fixtures in the previous tutorial, we're now ready with the underpinning knowledge to start building a Docker container with Docker API. A quick recap of the workflow that we're trying to develop. So remember, we're going to be running tests that require access to a database, and we are going to be building a test database, which is going to be automatically created using Docker API. So the flow is that we initiate our test using Pytest. We then need to build a container in preparation to then migrate our Django models to that database and set up any other configurations required in that environment. Once that's done, we can go ahead and test. And then after we finish testing, we need to make sure we roll back and destroy anything that was created in that process. Let's start by moving into our test folder. So Django inventory and tests. Remember, we are still working in this test folder just so that we can centralize anything related to tests for now. You may later on like to move tests closer to the apps. So inside of our test folder, we have an inventory folder, model structural. So we have created some structural tests already in the previous module. Let's start by building a new fixture. Now, I already have a fixture because I introduced Pytest fixtures in a previous tutorial. I just need to get rid of that. So this fixture is going to be for, well, what we're going to find in this fixture is a Pytest fixture, which is going to be used to set up our test database. So let's create our fixture. And the first thing that we need to do is define the scope. Now we just need to ask ourselves at this point, would function be appropriate? Now remember, the function scope means that every time a function, a test function, calls this fixture or uses this fixture, the code is going to be initiated. Now remember, this code that we're developing here is going to be for building, creating, starting a test database. So the likelihood, at least at the moment, is that the test that we're going to build, we probably only need to build our test database once. So I'm going to set this to session, which means that when our test starts and call this fixture will then initiate the building of the test database. And then once the tests have finished, everything will be destroyed. So let's create a new function. Let's call this function. Now, there's a specific name I'm using here, which is going to be Django DB setup. Now let's remember that we are using Pytest Django. And if we move down a little bit here, just do a quick search, you can see it does actually specify the Django DB setup fixture, which is a top level fixture that ensures that the test databases are created and available. So this fixture is scoped to session. So it will run once per test session and is responsible for making sure the test database is available for tests that need it. So we can see here that if we call this, the default implementation creates a test database by applying migrations and removes databases after the test run. So what we've done, like it says here, we've overridden this fixture for our own version of setting up and applying migrations to the test database. Now, eventually, we are going to create a test which will require database access. So what we're going to do in that respect, let's just grab a test. In order for us to define the fact that this test, for example, requires database access, therefore we're going to need to create our test database. We'll utilize the Pytest mark Django DB. This is a Pytest mark which will tell Pytest Django your test needs database access. So remember that if we go into the requirements here, we do have Pytest Django installed, and that's providing us some utility features to allow us to easily integrate and work with Pytest and our Django application. So this is just features from Pytest Django, which you can read in the documentation. So by applying this mark to a test, it will mean that Pytest Django will initiate this Django DB setup, which will include setting up our test database via Docker API and migrating our fixtures over to the test database. Let's add the placeholder for now, because we now need to create a new function which will actually perform the task of setting up our test database. Right, so for that, let's, within our test folder, let's create a new folder called utils. Let's build a new module. Let's call this test database container. Right, so now we need to actually connect to Docker to actually perform tasks. Now to do that, we are going to need to install. We take a look at the requirements here. I don't think we have it installed just yet. Oh, I do have it installed. But we are going to need to install Docker. So go ahead, pip install Docker. Now, if you're wondering what you're installing, this is the Docker SDK for Python. So this, like it says here, a Python library for Docker Engine API. It's going to allow you to do anything the Docker command does. So essentially, we are replacing commands that we would type in the terminal with commands that we can pass to Docker to programmatically perform operations like create containers, remove containers, and so on. By all means, spend a few minutes just reading through some of the basic documentation related to connecting to Docker and starting to run containers. We're going to be connecting our project to Docker using the default socket or the configuration in our environment, which means that we need to make sure that before we run our Docker setup, that we actually have Docker running in the background. Otherwise, this isn't going to work, which is probably self-explanatory. If we don't have Docker running, then we can't connect to it and actually perform tasks such as create containers and so on. So don't forget to update your requirements if you haven't already done so. I've already done that. Let's move back into our test database container module. Right, so let's go ahead and connect to Docker. So I'll create this new function. Let's call this start database container. A new function, and then we will need to connect to Docker. So client equals Docker dot from underscore env. So we're going to need to import Docker for that to happen. There we go. Now, potentially, if Docker isn't running, that can potentially run for, I think the default timeout is 60 seconds, which can be a long time to wait just to be told that Docker isn't running or we cannot connect to Docker. So what you can do is just reduce the timeout here to something a little bit more sensible, 5 seconds. Like I said, the default is 60 seconds. So in case Docker isn't running in the background or there is a connection problem, then that's just going to be a little bit more prompt in providing us the details in 5 seconds rather than 60 seconds. Right, so with that in place, we now have a way to actually connect to Docker. So now we can start to perform some tasks. So let's use a try except block to actually see if we can connect or start to build a container. Right, so what we probably need to do first, if we just think about this logically, is we need to check if the container already exists. Now remember, we can't build the same container twice. We can only have one instance of a container if it has the same details. And at this point, we are going to be only building one test database. We aren't going to have multiple test databases running in parallel at this point. So let's first of all check to make sure that there is no existing container. So let's set out a variable and define the container name so that we always know the container is going to be called, in our case, testdb. So that's the container name. So what we can now do, now we've connected to Docker, we can see if a test container already exists. And of course, if it does, we can go ahead and remove it. So this equals client. Remember, we have our instance of Docker or a connection here to Docker in client. And we can now just simply select containers. And then we can use get. Okay, so we're utilizing Docker API containers. We're going to get some information, and that's going to be the container name. So we're going to try and return the container where the container name equals testdb. Of course, if it's already created, then we're going to return an instance of that container. We're going to be able to access that container. So print container. I'll get this right. Container, and then container name. Let's say exists. Right, so if it exists, we'll print out that the fact that container already exists. What have I done wrong there? Okay, I've not finished it. So what we want to do, if it does exist, let's get the existing container and then let's stop it. So we simply pass in the stop function, and then we can also use then the remove. So that just stops and removes the container via name. Now, if you like to print out something into the console to confirm that, print container, container name stopped and removed. Right, so of course, if there is no container, then we probably want to start to build a container. But for now, let's use the accept to let someone know that the container doesn't exist, and we're going to need to create it. So docker accept, so we need to capture docker.errors, not found. Capital, not found. And then let's go ahead and just print out something simple. Container, container name, and then does not exist. Before we start building the container, let's hook this up to our testing environment first. So move back to the fixture. We can now, from test.utils.test container, let's go ahead and import start test container. And then we can go ahead and call this. So container is going to equal start test container. So that will initialize our start database container utility script. And now we need to make sure that this script is globally available. So we're going to place a reference to fixtures in our conftest file. So remember that this will be initiated. Any code in here will be initiated when Pytest runs. So from import fixtures, let's do this properly. From fixtures, let's go ahead and import our Django DB setup. Now, if you're using linting and formatting tools like I am, so here we're using rough, you'll find that potentially if I press save there, it's going to remove like you just saw there. So I just need to make sure that doesn't happen. So let's add the no QA, and this has a code of F401. Yep. Okay, so I press save, and you can see now it doesn't get removed. So even though that we have called it, and it's suggesting here that we don't access it, it will be utilized by Pytest to make the fixtures available throughout our testing environment. Now we need to remind ourselves at this point that we are using Pytest Django package, and we are overriding Django DB setup. So we don't necessarily call this fixture directly. It's going to be inadvertently activated through applying a Pytest Django mark, which is utilized to access a database to one of our test functions. So let's go into tests. Now I've created in inventory, I think. No, in models. I've created this new file here called testdb. I I think I added that to the, in the inventory. So this is just a new file which you can build just to test this out. What we're going to need to do here is declarate this with the, let's import Pytest first. So we're going to need to declarate this with at pytest.fixture. No, that's not right. At pytest.mark, dot Django DB. So this is part of the Pytest Django package. Now remember, this is going to allow access to our database. I'll say that again. It's going to allow this test access to our database. So if I didn't include this, it would cause an error if I tried to access the database. So by doing this, it provides this test access to the database, and inadvertently, it also will be calling our Django DB setup fixture to actually set up the database first before it runs the test. Now remember that this is set to scope session, which means that we can utilize this on multiple tests, and it means that this fixture will not get initiated again, so it won't get reset and recreated. It will simply just utilize this fixture once to set up the database, and we'll see later that we can then, after the tests, we can roll everything back. Right, so with that in place, we now have a test which is going to hopefully run our new fixture. So let's just rename this so we don't have any naming conflicts. Let's just call this test X for now. Remember, this is just a test, so for us to actually see this all in action rather than it being a test that's going to test something in the database for now. So let's just make sure we're in the right place, and let's run Pytest, and you can see that we have an error. I always like to try and simulate a very common error that you may receive, because courses like this, we're very much following a path, and if that path is successful, happy days. But as soon as you have an issue, we don't, and it's always difficult to provide you additional information to help you resolve that problem in your particular case. So I do apologize if you see a lot of errors. I've tried to simulate and talk about them to try and give you a little bit more information to help resolve any problems that might occur through the process of following along with the code. Now, in this case, there may be two problems or two resolutions to this problem. One, you just need to make sure that Docker is updated in your requirements. Just make sure you've got the latest version. Now, in this case, I think the latest version as a recording is 7.1.0. So I might go ahead and update that shortly. And the second reason why you can experience this error while fetching server API is because you may need to update Docker. So just go into Docker and select, just make sure that you've checked for updates and you're using the latest version. Now, it's very likely that as this course ages, some of these dependencies may get a little bit out of date or may require changing. So if that's the case, just double check the requirements text and go ahead and install the latest version. So just check out the PyPy website, find out what the latest version is. I think as of recording now is 7.1, and then just go ahead and pip install Docker, the latest version. To keep things up to date, I'll just go ahead and pip freeze that and update the requirements text. And you can now see, although I manually changed it, we're now using Docker 7.1.0. So let's give this a go again. And this time you can see that we have a different problem. So we're told here that improperly configured settings.database is improperly configured. So please supply the engine value. Now, I was expecting that problem because of how we have currently set up our project, so don't need to worry about that for now. What is more important is you can see that our container setup has been initialized because we now return container testdb does not exist. So let's get back to our utils and our test database container. So clearly what's happened now is that the start database container has been initialized, and we have tried to actually inspect the containers that are currently running, and we found that the container does not exist with the name testdb. Right, so let's go ahead now and actually build a container. The settings that we require, or the configuration that we require, is pretty much exactly the same as our Docker Compose. So I'm going to lift some code in here. You can see that key values, we're going to define the image. That's going to be the same as our image that we're utilizing in our development database. We have the name of the container from our variable defined above. We're going to run this in detach mode. Now, this is very similar to utilizing the D flag when we run the Docker Compose command in the terminal. So running container in detach mode means that the container runs in the background. So this allows the terminal, or the command line session from which the container was started, to be free for other tasks. So in this case, of course, we're creating this container programmatically, so we don't want to have to deal with the terminal or command line session in the forefront. Everything's going to be in the background, managed by the container. So we need to be careful here how we define the ports, because remember that we can only have one port mapped to one service, so we can't duplicate ports. So here you can see that I'm using 5433 on my local machine, and when I initiate that port or send any traffic to that port, it's going to be sent to this test database container, and the Postgres service is still looking for any traffic on 5432. So all that's happening is we're going to be sending messages to this database on 5433 locally. That's going to be routed to this container on port 5432. Right, so last of all, the environment variables, two mandatories, the username and password, that's going to be required. Now, we are just going to be placing this code directly into our code base. It is a username and password. Maybe want to manage that more securely, but in this case, remember, this database is purely for testing, so it's kind of irrelevant almost, the username and password at this point, until we start maybe testing the security of our database, of course. But for now, I think that's going to be suitable just to get this all started and for us to then move into building our tests. Now, in addition to that, we are also going to need to remember that we do have an initialization script for Postgres, which creates a database and performs other actions, including creating schemas and altering the search path. So we need to make that available to our test database. So let's import OS. Let's build an absolute path to it. Let's call this script directory equals os.path.apps path. And then what we need to remember here is we initialize Pytest from the Django inventory folder. So we're going to work from there. So to find the Postgres script, we're going to need to move out of the Django inventory folder and then into the Postgres folder. So we move out of the Django inventory folder into Postgres, into our scripts. There we go. Now remember, we don't need to define the actual script name. Anything in this folder will be copied across and run when the container is initialized. So let's make sure that we update the container configuration for this. So we're going to set up volume like we have previously, volumes. This is going to be in doubles. So volumes, just zoom in a bit. Square brackets, and let's go ahead and F script directory. That then needs to be mapped across to Docker and entry point init db.d. Just double check that. init.v.d. Yep. Okay, so we just simply mapped across that folder so that it can be initiated when our test database starts. So we can run that script and build all of our test databases and define all the configurations and so on. So with that in place, we should now have everything that we need to start a new container. So let's go ahead and try and run a new container. So let's build another try except. So try, what we want to try here is to actually start a new container. So let's say container equals client.containers, and then we want to pass in the run method, and we want to pass in then our configuration, our container config. Okay, so that is going to start a new container, hopefully. What we can do is run maybe a print. You can see that I've added some different outputs, so that would indicate that the container has started. That may or may not be useful. And there we go. So let's give that a go. Right, so if we go back into our terminal, just trying to clear all that, let's give this a go. Now, before we run Pytest, let's just make sure we finish this off. So accept docker.errors API error. So we'll just capture any errors that we might have. So let's go ahead and just print out F failed to start container, and then let's pass in the error. And we can go ahead and raise that. So that just finishes that off. So let's try this out. In the terminal, let's type in Pytest, and you can see what we have here is container testdb does not exist. Container testdb has started. So remember that is right here. So we must have started our container, and we've printed out the container has started. And you can see that we do then have this error, settings.database is improperly configured. That isn't related to anything that we're doing right now necessarily. So we are on track, so we can ignore this error for now. So it does look like we have a new container. Let's take a look at that. Let's open up Docker. Let's go to a desktop, and you can see we now have our test database, and it looks like it has been created successfully. You may have a problem of mapping across that initialization script, so just make sure that you have created the database extensions and schemas, etc. Just make sure that is in place and there aren't any errors in this log, and you should be good to go. So the workflow so far is that we initiate the function. First of all, we check to make sure if the container exists or not. If it does, we remove and stop it, and then we can go ahead and build a new container. So we've defined the configuration for our container, and then we've gone ahead and initiated a new container. And if there are any errors, we've just gone ahead and tried to capture those should the container not start. So we did try this, and you can see that we have started the container and so on. Let's just run the container again. Let's just run our Pytest tests again. And you can see that this time, in actual fact, we're told that it exists. And we stopped and removed it, and then we've gone ahead and started a new container. Right, so in terms of our workflow, that is the first stage completed. We now have the basic underpinning set up, creating our container, and now we need to think about the Docker HealthCheck, how we're actually going to ensure that everything is running before we go ahead and run our migrations.